Open source software is a cornerstone of our industry. If you aren't relying on it somewhere in your development process, you're probably doing something rather weird. From Linux to JUnit, from Eclipse to React, and literally hundreds of thousands of other projects, it's pervasive. Marek Squires had two extremely successful open source projects, each with millions of downloads per week. But then he decided to sabotage his own projects and as a result disabled thousands of other people's projects that relied on them. Is he a hero or is he a fool? How should we think about open source code that we depend upon? Hi, I'm Dave Farley of Continuous Delivery. Welcome to my channel. If you haven't been here before, please do hit subscribe. And if you enjoy the content today, do hit like as well. I'd like to begin by thanking our sponsors, Harness, Equal Experts, Octopus and SpecFlow. They're all helping us to build our channel, so please do support them in return by checking out their links in the description below. In this episode, I want to talk about the latest open source debacle. Marek Squires had two very successful open source projects, Colors and Faker. Colors was averaging over 22 million downloads per week and Faker 2.5 million. Then he decided to sabotage them by adding an infinite loop that printed an American flag on the console forever. Colors.js allows you to add color to console logs and so help with readability. It's not exactly rocket science, but you can imagine it being useful when you like to do that, even though it's not really terribly difficult code to write for yourself. So, for the cost of saving a few minutes writing some code to add colour to your logs, your system was made unusable. Faker allows you to generate random data for testing, and apparently does things like correct internationalization of the random data. So it's a bit more complex and so perhaps more valuable as a third-party add-on. One theory for why Marek chose this action, though, is that he was disillusioned by someone using Faker to make money. He wrote a post describing his thoughts on this last year. In it, he claims that he offered to sell his open source project to the company that was using it as part of their commercial product. He was clearly disappointed not to get an offer. Now, there's a lot of work that goes into some open source projects, but by definition, an open source project is not aimed primarily at making money. And if that is what you think your open source project is for, you're making a big mistake. A tiny fraction of open source projects do become commercial concerns, but they don't usually start out with that as their goal. And if they did, I'd say it was probably an unreasonable expectation. A successful open source project can certainly enhance your reputation. It can allow you to have fun, scratching some itch that isn't fulfilled by your day job, or learn about different kinds of problems that you'd like to work on. But most people who contribute to open source do it for altruistic reasons, or at least not for commercial reasons. Contributing to a successful open source project will almost certainly improve your chances of getting a good job, but it's extremely unlikely to make you rich. One of my friends, Gil Tene, once said, "Some of the finest minds of our generation are busy trying to figure out how to monetize their open source projects." For most people, it's a hobby. It may be a hobby that people would love to be paid for, but then golfers or skiers would probably say the same too. Marek didn't seem to think like that, though. He decided that he was owed for his work, and he took action and sabotaged his own code in protest. GitHub issued a security advisory for colors.js, warning users not to use the versions with these changes in them. Marek also then tried to mislead people by posting explanations that lied about who had caused the problem, trying to level the blame elsewhere. This change has impacted thousands of software projects that use these tools. Even if you didn't download these packages directly, they're used as components in thousands of other open source projects, downloadable from NPM, so you may have been hit by them anyway. I don't have any data on the costs of Marek's action, but it seems pretty certain that it will have cost a lot, even if that cost is only the work needed to step back to an uncompromised version in the builds. I think this incident raises several interesting concerns. Open source software has a long history. The Wikipedia entry describes it like this. Open source software is computer software that's released under a license in which the copyright holder grants users the right to use, study, change and distribute the software and its source code to anybody for any purpose. Open source software has its roots in something called the Free Software Foundation, created by Richard Stallman in 1983, which, amongst other things, published the GNU operating system and series of tools. Its aims were to promote the universal freedom to study, distribute, create and modify computer software. But the foundation also had an aspect of social activism at its heart, which didn't really endear it too much to big corporations. So the Free Software Foundation was and is still seen as a bit radical in some places. So open source was invented as a more palatable approach. Open source has a formal agreed definition, which includes that it should be free to redistribute. The license shall not restrict any party from selling or giving away the software as a component of an aggregate software distribution containing programs from several different sources. So Marek Squires was wrong to blame people for making money from using his software. The definition also says there should be no discrimination against fields of endeavour. The license must not restrict anyone from making use of the program in a specific field of endeavour. For example, it may not restrict the program from being used in a business. So Marek was also wrong to say that corporations shouldn't use his software to make money. Of course, he's free to share his work as he sees fit, but he can't make that choice and release his software as open source. Now, I can imagine Marek being disappointed by the results of his choices. He wrote some code that millions of people ended up using, and he wasn't making any money from it. But it was open source. You don't make money directly from open source software. He chose to distribute his code this way. No one forced him to do that. When other people then used his code to make money, it was probably frustrating to him. But that's explicitly part of the deal for open source software. These are the consequences of his choice. I use this channel to describe what I think are useful ideas, but I don't get paid when those ideas are used. Even if they're found to deliver significant commercial advantage, I don't expect to be paid. I made the choice to talk about these ideas as a way of spreading them more widely. If you find them helpful, even profitable, then I'm pleased for you. I'm not averse to making money. I advertise books and training courses and sometimes accept sponsorship deals so that I can earn a living doing something that I enjoy. But where I expect to make money from this effort, it will be peripheral. You don't pay me for the ideas or Marek for his code. I or he need to find other ways of making a living from our ideas being popular. I think that this is the choice that you make when you decide to release open source software or maybe release YouTube videos. I confess that I think that Marek Squires was at least naive to expect anything else. To then go on to punish his own users for doing what he gave them explicit permission to do by releasing his software as open source is simply crazy. There are some big advantages to releasing software as open source. It's a lot less work than releasing something commercially. There's a lot more stuff to do if you're going to get people to pay for it, and there's usually a different standard expected around things like documentation and support. But these are places where you can value add and make some money if you're sensible with your open source project. I don't mean to suggest that all open source projects are simple. They are not, but they can be. In the early days of open source, many professional organisations and programmers were very sceptical. I confess though, I've always been a fan. I think it does what it's set out to do. It gives us great access to software, big and small, that we can use, learn from and rely on to help us to do a better job. But with the introduction of easy-to-use dependency management tools and the proliferation of public repositories for such software, It also means that in recent years we've kind of reduced the granularity of software that is sensibly worthwhile taking from someone else. I haven't looked at the code for colors.js, but I'm pretty sure that if I wanted colored logs in my console, then this is a simple enough problem that I'd probably just write the code myself, not look for something from a third party. I'd certainly never pay anyone for code like this if my choice was to pay someone or write it myself. Even if my code wasn't as good as colors.js, it'd be good enough for my needs. There are a couple of thresholds here, I think. Code needs to deliver a certain level of value before we will pay for it. And code needs to deliver a certain amount of value before I, at least, will use even a free version from somewhere else. There's a cost to using other people's code, and we need to think about that too. We've lowered the barrier of entry for sharing code. I may take something like Colors for free, but I'd never pay for it. Where you draw the line is surely personal, but you have to factor in those costs and risks. Could imagine using Colors if I knew it existed and had the need for colored logs, but even if I knew it existed and had a need, I couldn't ever imagine thinking it worthwhile to use something as simple as LeftPad, for example, which crippled thousands of systems when its developer deleted it from NPM in 2016. I know that we get a bit obsessed with don't repeat yourself sometimes, but sharing code, particularly external code, has a cost associated with it. So there's a limit to which the sharing is worthwhile. More importantly though, what on earth were people thinking when they used Colors or Faker and simply took the latest version? They allowed the systems that they were responsible for to be built with any old version of the library? I know that this is a very common practice to pull the latest versions of dependencies from public repositories directly into builds, but I confess that I don't see why this is ever a good idea. It simply opens the door to external third parties who may be incompetent or malicious and allow them into the internal workings of our system. Depending on what the library code does, this may be fatal for your system. Why take the risk? Sure, unless you test every eventuality for every dependency, you may still be at risk of a change in third-party code. But by taking control of when you choose to take an update, at least you are now in control of the timing of when you expose your system to that risk. And so, presumably, in a better position to identify the cause of a failure if it occurs. I tend to aim to make my software deterministic. I want every bit and byte that I release into production to be the one that I intended. I'm not going to take the latest version from a public repo for anything, at least for important software. I will always state the version that I want in my build systems and acceptance test my software using that version before I release. I see this kind of control as a vital part of software development. We need to definitively take control of the versions that we test and deploy. It may be fine to take the latest version from a teammate, or even from another team within your firm. But I don't think that you can ever justify taking that risk for software that comes from somewhere outside. And certainly not from a public repo delivering open source software, which, as far as we know, anyone could have worked on, genius or villain. There's another aspect to all of this though. Big firms do take advantage of the generosity and enthusiasm of open source producers. As I've said, I think that Merrick was naive for expecting payment for what he gave away for free. I think it's foolish to expect to make money from open source software. For some kinds of open source projects, you can certainly make money, indirectly with support contracts or consultancy. But for smaller, simpler things like Colors, for example, then you almost certainly won't. That's not what we do it for. I was involved in releasing a fairly successful open source project called Disruptor. By releasing it as open source, we got great feedback that helped us to improve it. And we as a company could use it to promote us and demonstrate how good our software was, which helped us with recruitment at the time. It also prompted me and a few of my friends to start talking more publicly about software, which I guess ended up with me talking to you today here. But if you want to be paid for your code, then get a job that pays you for your code. Or make your code into a product and sell it. That's not what open source software is for. The way that big firms let us down, though, is by refusing to support open source, either through publishing their own work to the community, by paying their own developers to make the open source software that they use better, or by funding open source projects explicitly. We suffer from a kind of tragedy of the commons, where because it's free, few people value it as highly as they should. A 2008 study estimated that businesses saved around $60 billion using open source software. It should be in their interest then to reinvest some of that money. An article on opensource.com lists 8 ways that firms can help, including hire open source maintainers to work on open source projects that you use. Launch an open source fund. Support and join open source foundations. Fund and participate in open source internships or retreats. Open source has made a great contribution to our industry. We should support it and the people that produce it better. But we also need to understand that what we're agreeing to when we take part and produce it. Thank you very much for watching.